let's go ahead and get started again. Pick up right where we left off. So basically we have our keyframes set up, and the issue that we were running into was that basically, even though the keyframes look like they're in the right position, the timing's okay. When it gets to the top of each of these bounces, it's almost slowing to a complete stop, and it looks really odd. And in order for us to kind of uncover the root of this problem, we're going to have to use the graph editor. So in a program like After Effects, or if you're using something like Maya, a graph editor is going to show you what is going on behind the scenes. And what I mean by that is that, remember, we had put these keyframes in, but the computer is kind of deciding what happens between here and here. And we were able to change what the computer thought was happening by, or change what the computer rendered by adjusting like the ease in and ease out and the arcs and the paths. But beyond that, it's still very computerized. And so if I hit the spacebar, you'll see it still doesn't look quite right. There's something going on. And if we look in the graph editor is going to show us what's going on behind the scenes. So you'll have to select this little button right here. It's called Graph Editor. And once you select it, if you have an object, or excuse me, a layer selected, you will see what's going on. And so the red is the X coordinates, and then the Y coordinates are in green. So basically, here are your X and Y on this particular keyframe, and then if you got to this keyframe, here's your X and Y, and so on and so forth. And you'll notice that the Y coordinates look parabolic. They look a lot like the way that we sort of drew out the curve, and that makes sense because it's slowing as it goes up, right? Slowing as it goes up on each bounce. Okay, when it gets to the top of the bounce, it's not moving very much in the Y direction, that's up or down. And then it very quickly starts moving in the Y direction on the way down. However, you'll note that there's also something going on. I'm going to zoom in using the little mountain peaks over here. There's something interesting going on with X, and that is that X also seems to have some stopping points. You notice that it looks like it's almost stopping. You see that? It actually slows to almost a complete stop, where X is not changing over across these few frames, 1, 2, 3. X is almost not changing value at all, and that's the forward momentum. Now that's a problem because even though we do want it to get from here to here, right, it has to within that time frame in order to match the reference video that we took. We don't want it to take these little stops. We don't want it to stop, almost cease momentum going forward as if it's slowing in. So there's a couple different ways that you can do this. The easiest way is going to be to separate your X and Y values, okay? And if you look down here, there's actually a button called Separate Dimensions. If we click this button, you'll note that the graph changes a little bit, okay? And the reason is because it's separated out the X and the Y position. Now we want to do that so we can start seeing again what's going on in these XY positions. So you have a couple different options here. You can either go in, okay, and try to fix this graph manually, all right, by basically adjusting all of these manually, or we can delete the X coordinate keyframes. Now, there are some issues with deleting the X-coordinate keyframes. I'm not super worried about that right now. I think it'd be a simpler solution. So the first thing that I'm going to do is actually go through and delete those X-coordinate keyframes. So if you hit Command while you're in the graph editor, it brings out the pen tool, and I'm going to delete all of them except for 1 and 2. And I don't want this to slow in, okay? Now, almost immediately, you're going to be like, oh, I regret doing this, because it's completely changed the graph, right? Now it looks really weird. They look like cones. They're kind of back to being somewhat even again. But here's the thing, is that that's the X value, The Y values are still locked in. It's just that these parabolas need a little bit of work again. That's really the only issue here, because remember, it was set up to favor X and, or to use X and Y values, and now it's only using just the Y values to sort of help define this arc. So it does need to be adjusted. And you might be thinking, well, that's a little bit of extra work. Why didn't you just do this to begin with? Well, there are times where it's not going to be a big deal. You're not going to have to worry about doing this in the graph editor as much. So I still think that keying out your keyframes in the the timeline is prudent, because again, you're not always going to need to kind of redo this, as it were. And I'm going to give that a little more of an arc, kind of going down. And so there we go. Now we have a more accurate parabola, okay? And it looks okay. I think this first one is a little steep, but it was a little bit steep, so that's okay. And then I think coming into the second one, maybe it should be a little less steep. But let's play that back now. Oh yeah. Now it has a really nice pop, pop, pop. And it does slow at the top, but it never slows forward momentum. It only slows in up and down momentum, which is really what we want, right? And if we were to blur our eyes and kind of ignore the rotation, I think that you would see that that basketball from the original video looks quite right. The other thing that's kind of odd right now is we don't have any squash or stretch, and we're going to get to that in a minute. Squash or stretch being another principle of animation, and it simulates motion blur. Okay, it simulates motion blur. If you remember in the original video, and I'll go ahead and pull that up, there's a lot of motion blur yeah, you'll see that my keys are actually off now. So we may even want to go ahead and adjust that while we're doing this. But you'll see that in this, oh, we got rid of that X keyframe. I'm going to adjust it by pulling down the parabola here. And I think, that should be a little more accurate. Yeah. It's pretty darn close. Again, we're not super worried about it being 1-to-1, as long as it's pretty close. So I think it looks good. I don't really want to mess with this side too much. If anything, it might be a little more like an S, where it's sort of slowly moving forward, and then it speeds up a little bit on the bounces, and then it slows as it's going forward again, slows down. Okay, anyways, back to what I was saying before. If you look on the motion blur of that ball, you see that it looks kind of like it's being blurred, obviously because of the camera, and our eyes do see motion blur in real life. Our eyes see it around a shutter speed of 1/50, that's 1/50 per second. But what animators have done for a really long time, before we had the ability to do camera simulation like motion blur, essentially, with programs like After Effects, is we would use squash or stretch to kind of exaggerate weight. It emphasizes weight, it emphasizes force, it emphasizes speed, and these are things that are really important to an animator. So we are going to mess with squash and stretch, but we also we're talking about doing some rotation on this ball, and the reason we were going to do rotation was because we wanted to look like it's kind of spinning around, and it would be a more dynamic animation. But we added those stripes on the basketball so that we could do rotation. Okay, so that being said, we want to go ahead and go back and do the rotation. So I'm going to get out of the graph editor. I'm just going to click on the graph editor. I'm going to hide my video again, lock that layer. And I'm going to go back to these keyframes. You'll see now that there's an X and a Y position, and that these are all changed. At this point in the process, it's not good to kind of mess with these keyframes unless you absolutely need to. You can maybe shift them around a little bit. Like if you want this to hit earlier, I could pull this one forward and it would hit earlier. It's not a big deal, okay? But you just want to be careful, all right, that you're not messing with it too much, okay? And so what we're going to do is we're going to rotate this thing. So I'm going to click the stopwatch tool by rotation, and we're going to do our rotation first. But before I do our rotation, I'm just going to make a quick note that if we rotate, okay, then the scaling that happens is going to happen in object space, not world space. So even though we are rotating, or even though we do want to kind of turn the ball, as soon as we turn the ball, let me show you. Let's turn it like roughly 90 degrees. Okay. As soon as we turn the ball, suddenly the X and Y position, and we need to unlock it to see it. So there's this little constrained proportions. Let's click that, get rid of it. They actually switch. So if I were to do that, look at that. It's actually turning. That was actually the Y, and it almost looks like X by the time it hits down here. Does that make sense? So in the beginning, this was an up and down scale. But because we rotated it, now it's a left and right scale. So we have to be diligent about what it is that we are trying to do here. We want to be careful that we don't mess it up for ourselves. There are some ways to nest animations and do a real simple squash and stretch after the fact, those kinds of things. That's certainly one way to do it. I think the simple pragmatic solution would be to consider it as 90-degree turns each time. Okay, if we do a 90-degree turn each time, then we're not going to run into a whole lot of trouble, because as long as it's 90 degrees, we can do squash and stretch according to whatever axis, because these axes are like a cross, right? And as long as it's turning a full 90 degrees on each bounce, then we will be okay. All right, there's not a problem. There's not going to be a problem, okay? So just basically what I did is I have at 0, and then the first one will be 90, 91, doesn't matter. And then 180, and then 270, and then it says 1 times 0 degrees. So 1 times means it's been a full rotation. So don't let that freak you out. That just means it's rotated once fully, okay? And now we can keep going. 90, and then back to 180. And it actually looks like it's going to go a little past 180, so I'll put 190. Because it technically, the peak is right here, right? So we want it to keep rotating. And now it's, it's okay. It looks like it's bouncing, it's not spinning a lot. It looks like it's kind of bouncing with the spin, but it looks pretty good. I personally think that with rotation, it actually looks fine without a whole lot of, like the only kind of rotation I might change is this beginning. I might do an ease out. Yeah. So it looks like the rotation is kind of spinning, like speeding up as it does that first drop. But beyond that, I don't think that you need to adjust the rotation. I think it's pretty good. So that being said, we're in kind of a good spot with rotation. I don't think we need to do anything else right now. We'll wait and see what happens with scale. So going back to the beginning, let's talk about scale. So remember, scale has to do with squash and stretch. And when we keyframe this first keyframe, we might have to come back and adjust some stuff later. But the key here is that essentially 100, 100 is our baseline. Basically what we want to have happen is that we want it to stretch and start to elongate on the way down, right? And it's going to simulate motion blur. But we don't want it to go so far that it's long all the way to here, because on this frame, we want it to actually squash. Okay, and you're also going to note that when we do this, it's going to mess up a little bit the position because it's not going to be on the floor anymore. And that the simple solution would just be to raise the floor, which I think we'll do later. So let's just wait on that, not panic about it just yet. But we want it to start sort of slowly stretching out as it's picking up speed and then squash. So right before it hits that bottom keyframe is going to be where the most amount of stretch happens. Now, right away, you'll note I put 130, but this still says 100, and it looks bigger. And that's because it actually is. Whenever we take and add to the y or the x, we have to do the reverse for the opposite value. So if I add 30, okay, to this x coordinate or this x percentage, then I need to subtract 30, and that's actually going to maintain volume. All right, that's really important. Volume control has to do with solid drawing. That's not losing your volume. Solid drawing is a principle of animation, and it has to do with controlling the model, making sure things look accurate, often three-dimensional, And in this case, we want to make sure that it's correct. So I'm going to have an equal part reversal here. So I'm just going to do 70, 130 on this next keyframe. So we had 130, 70, and then 70, 130. And you'll note it's not on the ground. And we can either move that position. If you're worried about it right now, you can go ahead and move it. Or you can move the whole floor later. Like I said, I might just move the floor later and see if that's an easy fix. Another thing that's kind of weird is it's sort of starting to turn. See how it turns while the stretch is happening? We really want it to stretch according to the arc. So what I am going to do here is I'm going to start fine-tuning this right away. On rotation here, I'm actually going to pull that rotation back so that it matches the direction of the arc. And that way, yep, looks good. That way, it doesn't look like it's sort of turning like almost like a potato or something. Okay, that's really odd looking. So I'm going to turn that to match the direction of the arc. And then I'm going to go ahead and hit Command, and I'm going to undo this little default thing that happened here, because I don't like that. I don't want it to change the way these are moving through these frames. And it's because I did a slow out here. It shouldn't do that later on. But now if I leave it, look at how weird it looks. Yeah, it's super weird. So yeah, it's stretching out, great. It's going to squash, and then it's going to bounce right back. I think every time it does it, we should make it lose some. So I'm going to do 125 and see if that works, and 75 and see if that works. So as we exit this bottom key, we want to make sure that it's bouncing off and the angle looks much the same. So we're going to adjust it, again, in reverse. And I like to take off maybe 5% each time and just start with that. And if we need to, we can change it later, but it's going to lose a little bit of that elasticity as it goes on because the force of the object is being lost every time it hits the ground. So that being said, you know, when it gets to the top here, it still looks odd. It's not regaining its form like a normal basketball would. And that brings me to another point, which is that in the very beginning, it does the same thing. It immediately starts warping, right? And we really wouldn't see that kind of a stretch on the basketball. We wouldn't see that kind of a motion blur on the basketball immediately. And so if we were to look at this now, I'm going to zoom out just a little bit. Yeah, it looks weird, right? So what we want to do is we want it to hold its form for most of this drop here, since it's moving so slow, and then really sort of speed up at the very end and get kind of stretchy at the end here, you know? So I think right around here, maybe about halfway on this first one, I'm going to go ahead and put a keyframe here for 100, 100. I don't want it to change position just yet. I want it to start kind of squashing and stretching right there. And that looks okay. We may even want to add a ease out here so it's not so abrupt. So that really like doesn't start squashing till the very end. Yeah, and even that I think is a little extreme. This ball is not that bouncy. It's not like a, you know, like a rubber ball. I mean, it's rubber, but it's not, you know what I mean? It's a big ball, and so it's got a lot of density to it. It doesn't change shape that much. So I think maybe what our first guess was here was a little off. So I'm going to do 120 and 80. I think that'll look better. And then I'm going to do 80 and 120. And you'll note I'm just clicking on these values and typing in the right value. And then I'm going to do 115, and I just hit tab to go to the next one. And 85. Yep, that should be right. Yep. Moving 5 each time, and then boom, back up. And then again, it's got to regain its shape. So again, by the time it's sort of slowed down, we really want that shape to be regained. We don't want it to stay looking like a weird potato or pickle or whatever. There we go. So it's kind of stretching about halfway down. It gets loose, it stretches, bounces, and then about, you know, halfway to 3/4 of the way up, it's regained its form. And again, we want it to stay in this form. So we do want to have a keyframe maybe around here, so where it's not moving. So in order to add a keyframe without actually changing the value, to add what we call a hold, H-O-L-D, hold, you would click on this little add or remove keyframe at the current timeline, which is over on the left, this diamond. And what that does is just keys the values that are there besides scale. And so now it actually has a hold. It holds 100, 100 all the way through here, and then it's going to, again, do the same thing. This time, that drop is pretty severe. So that's telling me something here. It's telling me that maybe I want to pull this back because I don't know if I want it to look that dramatic. We'll see. We'll see if it looks okay. I don't know if I like the spacing on that, but we'll try it out and see what happens. So last time when it dropped, we went to 120 and 80%. And then when we bounced off, we were at 115 and 85. So you could imagine, we could do like 110. Maybe that would be a good value. So let's do 110 and 90. Okay, so it's keeping its form. It's not gaining volume. And then let's reverse it. 90 and 110. All right. Yep, it looks pretty good. It doesn't, it doesn't look terrible. And then when it bounces off, again, it's got a recoil. So in this case, if we were doing flip-flop perfectly, it'd be 110 and 90. We may not want to do that. So we'll go to 108 and 92. And then I want it to regain its shape pretty fast. Because at this point, there's not that much squash and stretch. So maybe over 1, 2, 3, and then on the fourth frame, it's back to 100, 100. So it's really very quickly regaining its shape. And then again, it holds that shape. Let's move this over. Again, hitting spacebar to just quickly move that over. And it's in this case, it doesn't even really necessarily need a lot of squash and stretch in this one, this final bounce. I think generally speaking, 3 bounces is kind of where you want to sort of limit if you're doing a ball bounce exercise. You don't want to go beyond that too far in terms of squash and stretch. So I am going to have it squash and stretch. I'm going to just do 1, 2, 3 frames. So I'm going to have it go right here at 100, 1, 2. And then the last thing we ended off with was 108. So let's just do 105. Let's keep the math simple. 105 and 95. So there's not a lot of squash and stretch on that. 95 and 105. And then when it bounces off, we're going to kind of reverse it, but we'll just do like 102 and 98. So not a lot. And then really very quickly, maybe by the third 1, 2, 3 keyframes. So again, starting back here, 1, 2, 3. I guess that's 2 more likely. If I do my math. And there we go, 100, 100, and then we'll just leave it. So let's zoom out. Let's zoom out of this, and then let's click away, and let's just take a look and see what that looks like. Pretty good. There's a lot of pop on that one for sure. You'll see that it really, it really does kind of squash quickly and then zoom out. And that's good. And looking at it in slow-mo looks pretty good. I like it. I think the timing of it, in terms of being a basketball, the squashes and stretches are a little harsh. It's not really going that fast. But, this is our ball. We can decide what we want it to do. So I think having it be a little more exaggerated, exaggeration is another principle of animation. And I think having it be a little more exaggerated is good. And I honestly think that once we add in some motion blur here, it's going to look just great. So one thing to note is the bottom. Let's check out the bottoms. So here's where it hits once. Here's where the other hit is. It's just slightly off the ground. And then here's the first one. So in this case, because I didn't have a whole lot of squash and stretch, especially on the last 2, they look like they're almost, especially this last one, it really looks like it's on the ground, basically. So in this case, I am going to go ahead and click on it, and I'm going to move the position. And I'm just going to change the Y position by clicking and dragging right here on the Y position. Remember we separated those out? I want to be really careful not to change the X position. Sounds like I said X position. The X position. Because it's not really necessary to do that, and it would also adjust the keyframes. It would start keyframing that X position. So I want to be careful not to do that. I am going to zoom in and sort of let it go slightly beneath the surface. And then I'm going to go to this other one too and check that out, make sure it's doing the same thing. Yeah, let's go slightly lower. And all right, this is the last one. Kind of make that one go a little lower. Pretty good. Yeah, I think it looks snappy. I think the beginning is a little long in the tooth, so to speak. It's taking a really long time. Giving us the impression it's almost like floating in the beginning. And I think that's the way it was in the video, but I don't really like it for this animation. So we have a couple options. We can either drag all of these keyframes by selecting them and dragging them back, or we could just adjust the first keyframe and bring it forward. I think that'd be the easiest thing to do. Let's just give it like 5 or 6 frames of padding. In fact, in the video, hold on a second, I thought the video we like moved it. Oh, we did. Look at that. See, it didn't even come out until like right here. So we messed that up. If you caught that early on, way to go. I'll give you a piece of candy or something. I don't know. All right, I'm going to turn that off, and I'm going to grab these. I'm just going to click and drag, left click and drag, and I'm just going to shift them forward. And that will probably change quite a bit of this animation. Oh, gotta turn that back on. Oh yeah. In fact, when I did that, it messed up my parabolas. So this is another weird thing that happens with After Effects. Like if you start moving keyframes around, see that? It's like shifting them. That's wonky. We don't like that. So what we are going to do is we're going to go back to our XY coordinates here, and I'm just going to look at the Y position and see if I can change it to sort of fit a little better. But I think it's really that X position that is really messed up. Yeah, and if I just kind of pull this up, it's just true dramatic now. It kind of fixes it a little bit. It's better. All right, it's pretty good.